Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a guide that breaks down the pretty complex psychology and, maybe more importantly, the communication behind introducing male chastity into a cuckolding dynamic. So, we're going to start with the big question this whole thing really hinges on. How can a physical object, a lock, actually become the key to unlocking a much deeper psychological intimacy and a whole new kind of power exchange in a relationship? It's a paradox, right?
Okay, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into the core psychology, then the conversation, which is critical. After that, we'll talk about the practical side of the very first time, and finally, we'll look at how you manage this whole thing for the long haul.
All right, first step, the psychology of denial. What exactly makes this combination so compelling for some people? Well, the guide we're looking at argues that the answer is all about a fundamental change in how control works in the relationship.
So the big idea here is the shift from what you could call episodic control to continuous control. See, without a device, the dynamic might just pop up during specific moments or encounters. But once you add one, it becomes this constant physical reality. The control is always there, and that physical reminder completely separates arousal from the idea of immediate release. And this leads to a pretty interesting psychological development the source calls arousal tolerance. Basically, over time, the focus shifts. It moves away from your own personal gratification, and all that energy gets redirected towards your partner's pleasure and just the overall erotic feeling of the dynamic itself. It's kind of like a complete rewiring of how arousal works for you. So, what's the engine that's actually driving this change? Well, it's a classic psychological principle you've probably heard of: intermittent reinforcement. Think about it. When a reward, in this case sexual release, becomes unpredictable, our brain's desire for it can go through the roof. Our investment just intensifies, which makes the controlling partner's role that much more powerful. Now, obviously, this is not something you just spring on your partner one Tuesday night. The source material puts a huge amount of emphasis on this next part: assessing readiness and framing the conversation. In fact, it calls it the single most critical step in the whole process. So before you even say a word, the guide suggests you look for some clues, some behavioral signs. Does your partner seem to really get into the anticipation? Do they ask you for all the little details? Do they handle playful denial well? These can all be little green lights that their mindset might already be open to these ideas.
And when you do decide it's time to talk, how you frame it is, well, it's everything. The advice here is to present it not as some new rule you're imposing, but as a mutual exploration. Something like, hey, what if we explored a way to make what we already love about this even more intense? That makes it a team project, not an ultimatum.
And this part is really useful. The guide actually gives you a kind of script for 3 totally different reactions. If your partner's enthusiastic, the advice is to kind of pump the brakes a little, manage that excitement, and agree to start slow. If they're nervous, the key is to say, hey, I get it, and suggest you look into it together. And if they're resistant, don't push. The goal is to ask questions and really understand what the specific fears are. Okay, so let's say you've had the talk and you're both on board to explore this. How do you go from conversation to action? Those first practical steps are so important for setting the right tone. Now, when it comes to the device itself, the source material is very clear. Your first one is an experiment, not a lifelong commitment. The recommendation is to start somewhere in the mid-range. Understand what you're getting with different materials, like steel has that psychological weight, silicone is more flexible, but above all else, you have to prioritize a proper fit. And a short test run at home, totally non-negotiable. You want the focus on the mental challenge, not physical pain. For that first actual lockup, structure is absolutely your best friend. The guide suggests starting with something short and defined, like just a weekend, to build up confidence. It's also super important to have a clear way to communicate about discomfort, to make the actual locking moment a meaningful ritual, and to decide ahead of time what the plan is for the key. Its symbolic role is a big deal. So finally, let's look at how this whole thing evolves. How does it go from being this new, exciting experiment to a sustainable and even transformative part of a relationship? So the guide maps out this pretty predictable psychological journey. For the first few days, there's a ton of excitement. It's new, the fantasy is real, but then comes what it calls the frustration wall. That's where the reality of constant denial really sinks in, and that initial thrill can take a nosedive. The key, according to the source, is pushing through that phase, because on the other side is what it calls the new normal, and that's where the deeper psychological shift really starts to happen.
Now, this is where it can get delicate. Managing requests for release is a huge part of the long-term dynamic. The source really hammers home that you need pre-established rules to answer these questions. Is asking for release part of the fun, or is it a signal that something's actually wrong? The tone you use, the reason you give for saying yes or no, it all has to be really carefully considered. And then, over time, something really fascinating can happen. The actual physical device, the lock itself, can start to matter less. The dynamic gets internalized. It shifts from being about the lock to just this continuous, shared understanding that one partner holds the authority over the other's release, whether the device is on or off.
So, in the end, what this guide really emphasizes is that the practice itself isn't the point. The device, the denial, those are just the tools. The real goal is to build this unique and really powerful new foundation for intimacy and connection, all of it built on a consensual exchange of power. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. If a simple physical object can be the catalyst for such a profound psychological shift, what does this whole intricate dance of consensual power really tell us about the fundamental ways we build intimacy, trust, and connection in any relationship?